And if you have any questions or comments um, while one of our panelists is speaking, please feel free to leave them in the chat and we will try to incorporate it into the session. Toward the end of the session, we will also have an open Q&A during which you'll have the floor to ask questions if you'd like. Third, we want to remind you that if you hear a phrase or an acronym that you aren't familiar with, we encourage you to ask about it in the chat. My colleague Matt Yoder is watching the chat and will jump in to explain and translate as he's able. And so this is a space for learning and we encourage you to use it as such. And fourth and finally, please take a moment to introduce yourself in the chat. Thank you all for being here. So transitioning to our panel. So today we are going to hear from Charlie Thomas-Davison, who is the Director of Real Estate for Women's Development Corporation, a nonprofit community development organization headquartered in Providence. Next, we have Rebecca Schofield, who is a developer at Pennrose, which is a real estate developer that focuses on affordable, conventional, mixed income, mixed use, and planned communities. And Pennrose works throughout the country, and Becca works in New England, including on developments in Providence and in East Greenwich. Eric Alexander is the Director of Multifamily Programs for the Tennessee Housing Development Agency, which is the state's housing finance agency, or HFA. And which is an HFA is a state chartered nonprofit organization that provides financing for affordable housing. And he previously worked in Rhode Island at Rhode Island Housing, which is Rhode Island's HFA. And finally, we have Jennifer Hawkins, who's the president and CEO of One Neighborhood Builders, a nonprofit community organization headquartered in Providence. So thank you all for being here. And so now we're going to move into discussion. So as we dive into discussion, I want to share some grounding information on the cost of building affordable housing in Rhode Island. So this past year, the average cost to build a unit of affordable housing in Rhode Island was just under $400,000 in Rhode Island. So this average includes units of all sizes, including studios and 1 bedrooms up to 3 and 4 bedrooms. So over the past several years, as many of us know, costs involved in land values, construction, materials, labor, and meeting regulatory requirements have all gone up. So to start, I want to ask Jen to weigh in. Jen, One Neighborhood Builders has several developments in various stages underway right now. Can you help folks who are on this call understand some of the biggest drivers of cost when it comes to building affordable housing? And how has this number changed over time?
Sure. So good morning. Happy to be here this morning. I think that we need to sort of parse out building housing writ large and then building affordable housing. The cost drivers around constructing housing, regardless of the AMI of the eventual occupant, has just skyrocketed, right? And I think that affordable housing developers are feeling that more acutely because of the fact that we're trying to contain costs because we can't charge high rents or sell homes at high prices because of our mission and the work that we're trying to do. But the fundamentals of development, just like the skyrocketing costs of land, of increasing material costs, et cetera, are an industry-wide phenomenon. I think, speaking specifically from the nonprofit affordable housing developer perspective, when we're scouting out potential projects, we tend to want to have these ancillary impacts. Excuse me. So not just, let's just take a flat, parcel of land that's already connected to utilities and build housing. That would be lovely and relatively easy. But I think that there is this other impetus to take a brownfield and remediate it, or take a vacant commercial property and adaptively reuse it and bring it back to life. So the choice of taking oftentimes like the hardest potential sites to activate them and bring it back to life has additional costs associated with that. But it's important to hit many, impacts with the housing lever.
Thank you so much, Jen.
Sure.
So next I want to turn to Eric. So Eric, you've worked in housing finance agencies in several states, including Rhode Island, South Carolina, and now in Tennessee. So what similarities and differences do you see in these different states as it relates to the cost of affordable housing?
Well, the markets are dramatically different, of course. Rhode Island's more urbanized, still rural areas, of course, but South Carolina and Tennessee, much larger states geographically. Um, and as I said at the outset, markets are different, but the increased cost of construction, supply chain disruptions, which we're still apparently working through. At least that's what we're seeing in Tennessee right now. And now added on top of that, very difficult inflationary environment, both with respect to material goods, labor, and also interest rates, is making this challenge a real one everywhere, regardless. I think that Rhode Island is positioned better in many respects than some of the other HFAs that I've worked in recently, because there are additional soft sources and gap financing resources available that we don't necessarily have access to in my present agency. Also, Rhode Island is a lending HFA, meaning that they're a one-stop shop, particularly on the nonprofit side, for pre-development, construction lending, and first mortgage financing on multifamily. That's not something that is necessarily the case at all HFAs. At Tennessee, we're purely an allocating agency for tax-exempt bonds and tax credits. And we really don't have other resources to bring to bear to help finance these deals. I think that a lot, to a very significant degree, I think that affordable housing providers and practitioners in Rhode Island are blessed to have an innovative agency with a lot of resources to bring to bear. But the issues are still the same. Jennifer talked about a lot of them. Affordable housing development. Development's hard. Affordable housing development is harder. You're adding that additional layer of complexity, both on the finance side and really just on deal production side. Competition in Metro Davidson County, Nashville, for instance, is extreme on the market rate side, and available parcels for development, folks pay a premium for it. So to a very significant extent, affordable housing providers are having to utilize more challenging sites, more challenging existing buildings to get done what we need to get done in the affordable housing space. And that brings with it increased costs, increased time. Time kills deals. Those are some of the things that I see that are both common across all of the states and all of the HFAs that I've worked in, and a couple of the differences.
Thank you so much for all of that, Eric. I think that's really helpful in a lot of the complexity that you talked about. And so Becca, kind of changing gears a little bit. So energy efficiency and renewable energy are big topics in housing development and building science right now. And a lot of these are necessary costs. But can you talk about how sustainability policies in different states affect development costs?
Sure, and thanks so much for having me. It's great to see so many familiar faces and names. I think just to note, affordable housing developers generally are really mission driven and want to incorporate features that will improve a building's sustainability, add energy efficiency components. Like we want to do those things, but it costs a lot of money, whether you're installing solar, whether you're going to heat pumps, whether you're going all electric, and dealing with the related issues of utility costs, infrastructure, new technologies. So I think that we, as Jen and Eric have been describing, like we're already dealing with a lot of additional costs for a standard, if there is ever a standard affordable project. And then we want to do sustainability improvements, whether it's adaptive reuse or refinancing, preservation, or new construction. And the sustainability kind of funding to support those improvements isn't always available. And then when it is, it might not be enough, or the timing might be tricky. So we deal with we become experts where we didn't intend to be in how to access different pots of money or how to time it, how to apply for grants, which also means we rely on consultants and create other different costs. So in general, like there are a bunch of ways, there are a bunch of ways that sustainability and energy priorities are enforced, and it can be through code, it can be through permitting and zoning, it can be through the QAP from the Housing Finance Agency. So you're not going to score if you don't include these sustainability priorities, but also they're going to add costs, and then you're going to have worse scoring on the financing side. So I think that's just a really tricky puzzle that we try to solve, and the state really does guide what's possible. So, for example, in Connecticut, passive house is basically a requirement. So in, a lot of the affordable housing developers in that field have spearheaded, how do we make passive house work for adaptive reuse? That's really hard. There are a bunch of examples in Connecticut now where we don't really see that in other states. In Massachusetts, there's a statewide law for preserving existing affordable housing. So in the pipeline of refinancing and for the deals that get a lot of the 4% credits in Massachusetts, they're existing buildings that are getting new investment. So that's kind of how we see those priorities for preserving existing housing and existing buildings in an energy efficient way really play out state by state. And Rhode Island's been developing all of these new sources for those different incentives. But the balance is really tricky with cost plus impact.
Thanks so much, Becca, for laying that out generally and also giving some concrete specific examples. So now transitioning to Charlie. So Women's Development Corporation works in urban areas and also in suburban and rural areas in Rhode Island, including South or Washington County. So can you talk about what has contributed to development costs in suburban and rural areas you've worked in, and how that differs from your developments in urban areas?
Sure. Yeah, thank you. And I guess I would just start by saying that I think, it should be noted that there's affordable housing need in every part of the state, in every type of community, at every scale. I think that's should be obvious, but isn't. And I think even within the community, there's not always a recognition that the people that would qualify for these housing units are already there. And I think that kind of gets to one of the difficulties of developing. I think planning and zoning can always be challenging, and we've certainly run into serious challenges in urban areas as well. But I think when you're going into a more rural area, smaller towns, they haven't seen this type of development come. It sort of goes against what they think the culture of the area is, not recognizing very much that the population is already there, that these are already their neighbors. So I think there's kind of an education gap in terms of coming up to speed on what is affordable housing, that what the need is, and what is it even that we create. I think there's a misconception of what we build. So I think that's a little bit of a difference. We certainly run into opposition in urban areas as well, but it tends to have a different kind of flair. And in this case, I would say it's something very new for people, and they're afraid of it. And I think it takes a long time to get through the process to kind of begin to educate the planning board and those that come to the public meetings about that. So that certainly creates a time issue. And to Eric's point, time is money, or however you phrased it better than I did. I think another thing that applies to both rural and urban, but is certainly a factor in in rural development, is what is the parcel of land? So very often, to Jen's point, we're taking on properties that are otherwise difficult to develop. And I think that's both an opportunity, but it's also kind of what our options are. We have a hard time competing on the market for other parcels that would be attractive to other developers or other types of businesses. And so very often we are left with a parcel that has challenges, whether it be a brownfield or, significant ledge and lack of infrastructure. It could be proximity to wetlands and challenges with connecting to any, sewer or development of septic. So in the rural communities, what we probably see as the biggest price driver is infrastructure development. We are often bringing in a well at the cost of, if you really develop a well from the bottom up, it can even be $1 million, but certainly $500,000. there's already been an exploratory, if there's a well, but there's no pump house or anything, you're looking at $300,000 or more just to develop that pump house to serve a community of 40 or 50 people. So that's a cost that you don't find in an urban development. Likewise, I mentioned sewer. It's often not available at all, or it may be 2,000, 3,000 feet down a state road, which is, cost prohibitive for the most part. So then you're looking at septic development, in which case you're dealing with DEM and proximity to wetlands and what's the absorption rate of the soil. And so there's quite a lot of analysis, but there's real infrastructure there. Not to mention that the septic is some of the deeper structures on the property. So they're 10 feet deep. So that's when you start hitting ledge. So you're blasting, these kinds of things you don't typically find in a more urban setting. If you did, you'd probably just pick a different site. Getting power up the road or just getting power at all, I think is a challenge we've all had. And stormwater management is no joke. I mean, Rhode Island's full of wetlands, and the standard for stormwater management has gone up quite a lot. I think we're all seeing flooding everywhere. So it's getting tighter and tighter on what you can do. And so those are real added costs. And another I wanted to mention is how far off the road these rural ones tend to be. I mean, there aren't a lot of main roads with, developable properties that we could afford or are even available. And so we end up being 500 feet back off the road, which makes for a nice community, but it's a a town or state level road development that you're building, and you're also pulling utilities all the way up that road. That's just to get to the first building. And so I think the other thing that I was going to mention was about operating expenses. All of these things trigger future operating expenses. Snow removal for a mile of road versus an urban setting where, say, the city of Providence is clearing the snow and you're talking about a snow blower on the sidewalk. We might be talking about $20,000 for one major snow event. We've had that, so even predicting it, let alone dealing with it, is a serious thing. And for those who don't know, not only is it operating expense, but you have to carry those operating expenses in reserves and other things. So they tend to drive up the cost as the reserves that you need have to anticipate that. And then I guess one other thing, beyond infrastructure is just planning and zoning process is always hard. But I think in the rural communities, there's often lean on us to do more offsite improvements to kind of meet them where their gaps are. And so there's added expenses to upgrade systems that they have offsite to accommodate our population. So that gets expensive, all of that.
Thank you so much for that. Obviously, there's a lot of costs involved in everything you just said, and we could dive more deeply into all of that. I want to switch back to Eric. So Eric, and Charlie, you touched a bit on this, can you talk about some of the misconceptions you see around the cost of affordable housing?
Yeah, I think that Charlie did a great job of kind of laying out all the challenges. And that's something I would emphasize. I think all of us that are in it, we don't really have misconceptions. Our eyes are wide open. The misconceptions are external, and those are challenges that we have to deal with. And one of the points I want to go back to, Charlie said it, time is money. I said time kills deals. It really, affordable housing, I think that on the outside, a lot of folks just think of housing development as housing. Affordable housing is harder, and it does take more time, and that brings additional costs. And it starts from the very beginning. You're oftentimes, and I'm going to be repeating a lot again. Sorry, Charlie, to be essentially repeating, but I think it's worth repeating. Affordable housing developers are more often than not starting from the very outset dealing with more challenging parcels. You're dealing with NIMBY attitudes, and you've got a job of marketing and community engagement from the very outset that you don't necessarily have in market rate development. Complicated financing takes time. Complicated financing takes much more time. And this is another difference that I've seen moving from New England to the Southeast. It was not uncommon when I was working in Massachusetts and Rhode Island for deals to have a dozen or more. And Jennifer, I know that you are seeing this here at one on Center City, a dozen or more financing, a dozen or more financing resources coming into a deal. Those all have specific requirements. They have to be worked out. It's very complicated to make these different funding sources play nice together. Pre-development costs, because of all of this, pre-development costs are generally greater. Construction loan interest, because oftentimes in the midst of development, after you've already broken ground, you're still dealing with some of these vestigial issues that you thought you'd put to bed prior to getting started. So construction carrying costs are often higher in affordable housing development. Anything that's not new construction, this is another one that I see, anything that's not new construction carries additional cost. I think one of the misconceptions that folks often have is that, and this is not universally true, but it often is, one of the misconceptions people have is that if you're doing a rehab deal, it's going to be cheaper. You've got existing infrastructure, you've got existing units. It depends entirely on condition. There are often relocation expenses that are associated with undertaking rehabilitation. So, that's not necessarily going to be cheaper than new construction. New construction, you're starting from a clean slate. One of the things that I want to speak to from a Tennessee perspective, it's dramatically different from Providence to South County. And I'd be curious to hear, from the developers, what you're seeing in terms of attracting contractors to rural areas. Oftentimes that's a challenge. It was very much of a challenge in South Carolina and Tennessee. Understand that, as I said earlier, in New England, things are more dense and it's more generally urbanized. But rural is rural, and it's been a real challenge for our nonprofit partners in particular to attract contractors that are interested in even making a bid on rural housing development. So those are some of the misconceptions and challenges I see surrounding affordable housing development.
Thank you so much, Eric. I think that's a very helpful financing perspective, and also thinking about all of the components that you just talked about, geography and time. And I think I loved how you got specific on what exactly does time is money kind of mean. So we'll circle back to that question that you asked around attracting contractors to rural areas in a bit. But first, I want to circle back to Jen and just ask whether you can talk about any efforts you've seen either here in Rhode Island or elsewhere to drive down costs, and what role do developers, municipalities, financing agencies, and others need to take on to make this a reality?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. And even before I kind of just share some thoughts on that, I did just want to circle back to the commentary around operating costs. And to Charlie's point around, the exceptional operating costs working in a rural community. I mean, I think something that is unique to affordable housing, regardless whether it's an urban, suburban, or rural, are the extra compliance costs. For market rate development, you generally have a ratio of 2.5 maintenance to 1 office staff person, right? Because you really want to make sure that the property is shining, that there's amazing curb appeal. You really don't need all that much office support. In affordable housing developments, because of all of the recertification requirements and the compliance requirements that are driven by the funding sources that we obtain, the ratio is completely backwards. For every 1 full-time maintenance staff person, we have 2.5 office workers. And so, there's real implications for that, for how challenging it is to keep the operating costs tight because of the caps and rent, and really continue to have those shiny, beautiful properties. So I just want to kind of flag that, a unique operating expense associated with affordable housing development. But, getting to some of the kind of innovations or things that I've been tracking to contain costs, I want to give a plug to these 2 brilliant guys who are working at this it's a place called Thesis Driven, and it's this Substack where they put out kind of posts very frequently. Brad Hargreaves and Stephen Smith are the authors of this kind of online periodical, and just really sort of challenging a lot of assumptions around development. They're particularly plugged into building code reform. I think that, we have tried to tighten building code and for the premise of increased safety, but I think the pendulum has swung in a pretty extreme way. And I see there's several architects on the call right now, and I'm wondering what you're thinking as I say that. I would love to be able to go back to the days of having a single staircase in buildings and the ability to, have building code for residential up to 6 units of housing, where right now that is triggered commercial development, which requires sprinklers and et cetera. I think that we certainly are not suggesting that we should build unsafely, but I think that there are really strong lobbies in the fire protective space, and I think that we really need to come back to some common sense principles around building code.
Awesome. Thank you so much for bringing all of that in.
Sure.
And so turning now to Becca, can you talk about policy or regulation changes you'd like to see in the financing around affordable housing?
Sure. It's a bit of a loaded question. So I think it's obvious from all of the examples folks are giving and the way that we're talking this through that, affordable housing has a ton of hidden costs, obvious costs inherent with any site that we work on or building that we try to rehab. So I think, Rhode Island recently got rid of the threshold requirement for TDC, like a cap that's like, if you're over this, you are out of the round, you're not eligible, which is good, but they still score projects based on financing. Most states do that, not everyone does. I think there is this inherent race to the bottom that happens when you're trying to get points related to TDC. And again, just kind of relying on all the examples folks have given, there are a lot of costs that we can't control. So it puts developers in this position where it's like, so are we gonna, we gotta do septic? Does that mean we can't do the siding we want? Does that mean that we can't do all these other finishes that will benefit residents? Does that mean that we can't afford solar? So there are a lot of really hard decisions that we have to make. And to have that arbitrary TDC cap, I think is tricky. Policy definitely does not keep pace with the market cost of housing development. And we see that year after year after year, that costs are going up. And then maybe the next year, the QAP TDC cap will bump up a little bit, something like that. So I think that QAPs tend to be reactive, and you wouldn't want to restrict a project or say no to a project that could be great based on some of those arbitrary numbers. So I think big picture, housing is expensive. We still need to build it, right? So we have all of these other priorities that are built into the QAP that are really wonderful, that really shape mixed income housing, sustainability features, community resources within a building, around a building, all these supportive services that we want to include. So I think that there are ways that we can make sure that we're putting public funds effectively into affordable housing without having that TDC limit. So that's kind of as aggressive as I'm going to get about that. But I think that there's this dynamic where, because housing finance agencies and others put so much funding for sure, and also time and energy into developments, they do sometimes restrict what those funds can be spent on in a way that can really limit what services or what features we're able to deliver in the end. Like sustainability features are a great example of that. If the money doesn't come from somewhere, then it's cut, we're knocked out. So Yeah, I mean, I think that there are broader policy questions that we could ask. Again, it's not just the QAP that dictates this. There are a lot of other different types of funds or other regulations that others have mentioned that I think are valuable. I think that there are ways that developers are able to give feedback on the QAP, which is really, really productive. And I encourage everybody to do that. You know, here are our financing points, but here are the points that we get for sustainability. So here's an example of a project where they don't, like, those sustainability points don't outweigh what we lose in the financing points. Here's an example of a project where they would. And like, how do we talk that through with the folks that are trying to help us build the best housing?
That's awesome. Thank you so much, Becca. So our last question before we open it up to Q&A. So get your questions ready. So Charlie, kind of a two-pronged question for you. So kind of circling back to Eric's question about in your experience attracting contractors to rural areas for affordable housing. And also, could you share an example from your experience at WDC about developers or municipalities' role in helping reducing costs?
Yeah, well, let me start with the contractor question. I think, Eric, to your point, we're a small state that's more dense. And so we haven't had as much of a problem, I think, because I think the distance traveled basically from some of these contractors that are often located in Warwick or somewhere like that is kind of central. I haven't really run into a problem getting people to do the work. I think that what we have is a problem is we don't have enough contractors. We don't have almost any minority general contractors and virtually none that are on the Rhode Island housing approved kind of contractor list. I think that is a place where Rhode Island needs to seriously commit to developing, future, capacity there. Because while I can appreciate that Rhode Island Housing as well as Federal Home Loan Bank and others award, points as they should toward using, minority contractors and other minority, third-party folks like attorneys and such, it's like there's nobody to work with. And so I think that has been a challenge that we've run into. We would want to do that, and yet we can't find people to work with. But I think the main problem with capacity is just there aren't that many contractors in the first place. But I haven't personally dealt with having them not willing to, we do have a problem getting properties insured. I mean, that's a whole nother insurance has been driving cost really bad. And I think the fact that virtually all of Rhode Island is in some kind of hurricane zone or flood zone or something or other, we're running into problems where we literally cannot provide the coverages that Rhode Island housing requires for properties that, we cannot get an insurer to cover it. And so that's another cost driver. We've even looked at changing construction type, and it's not enough, or the costs associated with changing construction type are so high that it doesn't quite offset. So that's been kind of a problem in Rhode Island, I think. We're just a little postage stamp, it's like one storm and the whole thing is in a hurricane. So I guess to your question, Ellie, about what municipalities and such can do, I mean, we have plenty of examples in our recent experience, like in the last decade, let's say, of examples where a town came into the process as a partner. I don't mean literally a partner, but on the team, working together to get a final product. And what we found in that process is that we got the same number of units, twice as fast, maybe 5 times faster, cheaper, better. Everybody in the end had a better, buy-in to the outcome. And, the town holds, the projects up, as an esteemed, as a success. And I'll just say, like, Exeter was an excellent community to work with. And I think at the end of our development of Pineview, Exeter and everybody else living there, the people who built it, the people, we own it and operate it, are proud of the project. And it was a good example of a town being collaborative with us to get through the planning and zoning process. They still had their concerns. We were able to meet with them and work with their concerns and address them. That was a very good example of how you can save money by working with a town. I think that should be the standard, quite honestly, but of course it's not. I won't name any other communities, but we've had, the opposite experience in plenty others where we even have, multi-years legal battles at the cost of hundreds of thousands of dollars of lawyers just to basically defend our right to even present a project. So, I mean, you can see how that is a huge, huge cost driver. depending on how the town wants to approach working with you. I think in reality, the units will all get built either way. And it will just cost everybody more time, money, and energy if you go about it the adversarial way instead of the way of let's work together. I mean, we can change things. We're open. I always go into these conversations with, here's what we think, but we're here to hear from you. What do you think? And then let us come back. That's how we always start. Of course, we are immediately met with, flaming torches, like quite literally. And sometimes it's like a fight from the minute we walk in the door. So I think that, that's not the approach that the other side is always taking, unfortunately. So I think, just being kind of open to the process and being collaborative and letting it be a dialogue back and forth, I think is probably the best contribution a municipality could make. But there are some other more kind of concrete things like willingness to help with the road. They don't want to pay for it. So we offer to pay for it, and then I'm talking about 500 feet of road to get into the development that's built to a town standard. So it is effectively a town road, but because of the, paying for building it and then ultimately paying for maintaining it becomes on the books, has to be covered by 40, maybe 50 affordable housing tenants. And we know that the rents are not high enough to cover the expenses of what is basically equivalent of a town road. So I think, ideas I have is even could we enter into a contract with you for snow removal? You already are removing snow. We could pay. Can we be in your contract so that we don't go out and find a neighbor with a snowplow who, so I think it's whether or not they actually do the snow removal, and consider it their responsibility or just let us enter into a lower price contract is a good example of something that would help.
Thanks
I
so
think,
much, Charlie.
Yeah, sorry. But one other thing I just wanted to say, because I know is preservation is going to say, like, if you don't preserve affordable housing now, it just gets more expensive. And I think like a statewide priority to maintain the 24,000 plus housing units we have is critical. Building new housing is really important, but it's just getting exponentially more expensive if we don't preserve it now. So I just put my plug in.
No, thanks for that plug. That is an important point that we didn't touch on yet. So thank you all so much. I'd like to now transition us to a Q&A. So first I'm going to pull from questions that I see in the chat, and then folks can go, and then I'll open it up. So first I see a question from Jeffrey Hamill on, I think this was in response to something Becca said, but anyone can respond. When did Rhode Island Housing eliminate the cap on total development costs? Oh, and I see Jen responded the 2024 QAP.
Yeah, and as Becca also kind of noted there, that while the cap is removed, that doesn't mean that the sky's the limit, because they still score it, and if you have a high number, you'll effectively get kicked out.
Allie, if I can just have 30 seconds.
Yeah, go for it.
Of that. This is not necessarily an approach that would work in a small state, minimum state like Rhode Island. But what we did in South Carolina that worked very well is we eliminated a TDC cap. What we did is once we took in applications, we kind of divided them into categories, because the high rise and garden style and townhouse development all have different kind of average costs. But we put things in like buckets, averaged them, and then any proposal that was either one standard deviation above or below that mean, we just asked additional questions. There might have been extraordinary site costs involved that justified a higher cost, but you don't want to encourage a race to the bottom. So anybody that was too cheap, we wanted to investigate that a little further. But that was a really effective way to acknowledge that we're in a very rapidly increasing cost environment, and not somewhat artificially penalize folks for having to adhere to a TDC cap, which frankly is a lagging, cost is a lagging indicator anyway. You don't know what it costs today. So that standard deviation methodology was a way to kind of compare like projects in a current market and get a sense as to what was driving costs, what was reasonable and what was unreasonable. I just wanted to mention that.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Thanks.
Can I just add one thing?
Of course.
I think that follow-up is incredible, because it is hard to have kind of that arbitrary number, and Rhode Island Housing does kind of give you a little bit of a dialogue where you can appeal for a score that you disagree with, something like that. But that nuance, I think, is really, really valuable. There currently are like buckets of types of housing, and they have different TDC metrics. So you can be a podium style building is different than a townhouse, and those have different kinds of caps or targets, I guess, that you want to be above or below. But I think that actually can be really useful. Not, to give an argument for that kind of categorization, it means that you're incentivizing denser building types typically, which, is powerful when you go to a town and you say, this has to be 3 stories or more in order to be funded. And I think that's just, to the extent that works, to the extent that, as Charlie was describing, you can educate a municipality or community, that kind of a standard is helpful.
Awesome. Thank you all. So I see 2 more questions in the chat. One, Bob's question, in the spirit of reducing land costs for affordable housing, does Rhode Island Housing have an inventory of state-owned land that is or can be categorized appropriate by appropriateness for potential affordable housing? I don't know if one of our anyone want to?
I tagged Melina. I don't know if she is available to respond, but there is actually an effort to chronicle all of the state-owned property and then figure out a way to give a right of first refusal actually to nonprofit developers for affordable housing, at least state-owned property, like group homes and schools and so forth. So I think that, even just getting like that list is the first step. It's amazing that DCAM, I don't think to date has a reliable list of all the state-owned property, but yeah, I think that makes perfect sense, and at a municipality level too. But I think the state should lead the way. I do believe that last session there was legislation that passed that required the vacant state-owned properties, that there was an assessment if it could be for housing, and then that should be prioritized.
Awesome, thank you. So I'm seeing lots more questions come in. One more question that I see was answered, but I think I just want to highlight for those who aren't looking at the chat or who are watching the recording is a way to drive down costs is one example of is municipalities or other organizations or institutions donating land as a way to also help drive down land acquisition costs. So that's another point we didn't touch on in the discussion, but is having a lively discussion in the chat, and so appreciate that. And then Jeff's question on, is anyone exploring the possible synergies between affordable housing and farmland and conservation? Jeff, that's a perfect segue to our next Fresh Friday, which is going to be on this topic exactly, on housing and conservation and land conservation and these things that are seen as opposed, but actually have a lot in common. So thank you all.
And we should give a plug for the Grow Smart conference, Allie.
Oh,
so
yes,
May 3rd, our friends and colleagues at Grow Smart are having their biannual summit, and One Neighborhood Builders and our colleagues at Rhode Island Land Council are doing a session called something like Frenemies. Why can't, land conservationists and affordable housing developers get along? So next Fresh Friday and Grow Smart conference.
Awesome, thank you. So as we're a little past 9:30, I just want to take this opportunity to thank all of our panelists for their time, insight, and expertise this morning. And I also want to thank all of you who took out the time out of your Friday morning to join us and who offered your comments in the chat. We hope that you'll consider joining us for our future Fresh Friday. As we mentioned, our next one will be on May 10th on land conservation and housing, and we'll share program announcements to everyone who registered for today. And please note, as you exit the Zoom meeting this morning, a brief survey regarding today's event will pop up in your browser. It'll ask for feedback on today's session, so take a minute or two. So it'll help us continue to provide engaging and helpful Fresh Friday experiences in the future. So thank you all so much, and hope you have a great Friday. Thanks.
Thanks, Allie.
Thank you. Thanks.